moving on to Athlete 2 now, and this is Chris Robshaw, who played flanker during rugby. He's also a pro-level player. He suffered a broken wrist in a Six Nations game, and the broken wrist, was caused by a force of a tackle. Again, estimated recovery time 4 to 6 months. These stages were explained during the previous video, so I'll be moving straight on to the treatment, that will be varying for a broken wrist. So again, the hot and cold therapies will be used greatly during this period, the early periods, and then moving on, you'll see the hot and cold therapies actually this time will remain throughout. The soft tissue and deep tissue massages will then come into play a bit more at the remodelling and repair and remodelling stage. And acupuncture will also be used, which is a bit of a different treatment to what was used on the previous injury. So quickly examining what that looks like in terms of the line graph. And then moving on to the treatment overview. So during the inflammation stage, hot and cold treatments will be used again. You might be thinking that it's not muscular and that where would you put the wrist, for a wrist, where would you apply the hot and cold treatment? You'd be looking to apply it on the forearm area to the surrounding muscles in order to try and alleviate the amount of blood that is rushing to those areas and all that will be causing inflammation and discomfort for the individual. So it will be around the surrounding areas, not directly associated with the wrist. And also taping will be used a lot earlier on this, as the wrist will really need stabilising early on from an early time. And this will come from the taping. So the continuation with the hot and cold treatments to reduce the swelling will continue throughout. And also the soft tissue massages will be introduced, not the deep tissues just yet. The soft tissues will be introduced first, as these will help to lessen the pain that the athlete is suffering by alleviating it and manipulating the injured area. The athlete will also start some light strength, flexibility, and proprioception work. If you go back to the graph, you can see that these are quite low numbers on the graph early on, just to ensure that they're not overdoing it. And then the soft massage becomes more important later on during the remodelling stage. As does the introduction of the deep tissue massages, which will look around relieving some muscle tension that might be associated to relieve muscle tension. And then acupuncture will also be introduced here. This involves obviously needles stimulating the area, and it works as a preventative sort of pain relieving, and it is very minimal pain, so this will be good to for any potential damaged tissue or pain that the athlete is still suffering from. This will help to prevent it and relieve it. The hot and cold tissue cold treatments will also be continued throughout, and the athlete will also continue with the strength and proprioception and flexibility work, but it will become more prominent, it will become more intense, and more important the later on the treatment stage they get. So moving on to the short-term goals, and these will again be fairly similar to the athlete before, as they're quite generic for most people trying to battle back from injuries, but there are a few little differences that includes the fact that they're only have to they look to complete more ball work and complete the warm-up to training periods slightly earlier. The ball work will be particularly important for this athlete because he suffered a broken wrist. Obviously, that's going to affect his ability to throw balls massively. So obviously getting that back technique back in will be a big stepping stone towards getting back fit. Also with the tackling as well, because you have to lock your arms when you're making a tackle. That will obviously put a lot of pressure on the wrist area to maintain that lock. So competing in low contact games and stuff like that will be a real test for how well the athlete's wrist is repairing itself. Also handoffs, etc. will really test the athlete's injury. And obviously the goal will be to firstly get back for the reserves, but then to move into getting back with the first team. So moving on to the functional movements, and the first one is a wrist flexor. So this is where you apply pressure to the wrist by pushing it downwards with the fingers flat. So this will be the test the flexibility of the wrist, the ability to move the wrist. So obviously if this is too painful, which potentially it could be because there's quite a lot of pressure going on the wrist, apply less pressure. Obviously you can dictate how much pressure you're applying. So simply dictate the amount of pressure that's being applied. Lessen it if it can only go so far back, and obviously don't go nuts with it. Don't over push it back, otherwise you're going to cause yourself so much damage. It's ridiculous. When you can feel the stretch, there's the time to stop, and if any pain starts, obviously that will be the time that here's stop. And then decrease the time you're holding it for. So if it's potentially really painful, apply less pressure and then only hold it for a couple of seconds, say. And then obviously you can, if it's too easy, apply more pressure and increase the time that it's sort of being held for. Then moving on to squeezing a stress ball. This will a lot come from the wrist and the ability of the wrist to close the hand and apply pressure. So in order to make this easier, obviously you could apply remove the stress ball, so you're just doing that squeezing motion with your hand as far as it will go, just applying very little pressure at all, just getting the arm and the hand used to having that movement come through the wrist. And then you could use a pressure palm device, which is one of those like metal things with the plastic handles where you have to squeeze them fairly hard to get them to close, and that can be used. Then finally, wrist circles, so obviously rotating the wrist. If this rotation of the wrist is too painful, then slowing the movement down could help. So it's just not going as fast, slowing down that motion, slowing down the pressure on the wrist. And then instead of doing circles, if the whole movement is becoming painful, simply move the hand up and down, or sort of any movement in that hand, in the wrist will do. So any direction, but just ensuring that there is some movement being used on that wrist. And then obviously you could add a resistance band. So you could have your foot on the resistance band, pull up on the resistance band, and just have it pulling up, moving along with the resistance. Obviously that will make it difficult as there's more pressure being placed on the hand, the wrist, sorry. And then finally you could hold a light weight while rotating round the wrist with this weight in your hand. And then in total 30 seconds rest between each of the sets. Obviously there's not going to be reps for this, but you're going to be looking at 4 sets again. And it won't be reps, it'll be sort of however long the participant thinks that they need to do it for while feeling benefits of the movements. Moving on to strengthening. So with the strengthening, obviously with the wrists, you'll be looking at a lot of forearm strength in order to gain strength back into that wrist area. So for the first one, forearm curls. So this will involve the participant holding a weight and curling their wrist up towards the body. So obviously the ways that, if this is too painful, the ways will be to reduce the weight being used. Obviously to make it harder, you could increase the reps or increase the weight. But for this, I think using a lighter weight will be beneficial for more reps. So I said to 20 reps for 4 sets. I just think that you don't really want to be doing small amounts of reps on this. You want to be maximally, you want to be doing more high reps, high reps, high intensity sort of stuff. And then moving on, hammer curls. So this is looking at forearms again. And then the use of bands potentially, if the hammer curls are too painful, and there's too much pain coming through them, then using bands, so less resistance. The bands will provide less resistance than the weights. Will probably be easier to for the participant to do. And then you could remove the weight or the resistance entirely, so you're just practicing the movement in the wrist area, in the forearm area. And then obviously to make it harder, increasing weights, increasing reps, and this one will be sort of 10 to 12 rep range with 4 sets. And then finally a weighted 2-finger pinch. So this will involve a weight plate and gripping it with the top from the top of the weight. So this is a grip exercise. So holding the top of the weight with your 2 hands and pulling upwards with it. Test the forearm strength and the bringing it out straight in front of you. Test the forearm strength and the wrist strength in order to get it upwards. Obviously, in order to do this, if this is too difficult, too painful, lower the weight plate you're using. Hold a smaller plate, and then obviously you could hold a larger weight. And it's just working on that grip strength that is coming from the wrist. Again, 12 sets of 12 reps for 4 sets, and all of these will have 30 seconds rest. And then finally, again, as mentioned before, this won't be sets or reps. This will be working for a time period rather than sets or reps, so 1 minute again. So obviously the first activity will be practicing the handoff against a pad, against a defender holding a pad. So just practicing that, using that wrist strength, that forearm strength to shove off an opponent. If this is too painful, then instead of doing this running against the pad at full speed, practice the handoff statically against the pad, just standing there, pushing it off. And then you could practice the handoff against no pad, so just practicing the movement, practicing having the hand out straight and shoving maximally outwards. Also, to make this more difficult, you could add a semi-active defender, so someone that is providing a bit of physicality to fend off, but ultimately not full active, and then finally full active. They're wanting to try and tackle you, they're wanting to get you to the ground. You have to fully push them off. Moving on to the second to last activity, and this will be the passing. So 2-on-1 situation. It's not a full contact, it's just touch, getting that movement in the wrist, the flick of the wrist to pass the ball, and getting that movement back. Obviously, if that's too painful, then in a 2-on-1 competitive situation, limit this to slow running down the line, passing, because whether this is done statically or running isn't going to make a lot of difference. So just running, passing the ball along a line of 3, say, to an opponent, and just having to do that movement. And then again, adding a semi-opposed tackler, so someone that's adding a bit of physicality in order just to put that wrist under more pressure. And then finally a 3-on-2, so more defenders, more chance of contact, and that wrist being tested. And then finally, a 1-on-1 tackle. So practice at medium intensity, practicing having to lock those arms and testing that lock, the wrists coming together. Obviously, to make this easier, you could slow down the movement and lower the intensity, and then to completely make it easier, slow it down to stationary on your knees to keep the focus on the wraps. Increase